Welcome to GoldenAgeRadio.com, rumble.com/C/GAR. Brand new episodes every week. Visit VeteransRadioMinistry.com to listen to more episodes like this.
The lieutenant stood in front of the steel sphere and gnawed a piece of pine splinter. "What do you think of it, Stevens?" he said. "It's an idea," said Stevens. "I believe it'll smash flat," said the lieutenant. "He seems to have calculated it all out pretty well," said Stevens. "But think of the pressure," said the lieutenant. "At the surface of the water, it's 14 pounds to the inch. 30 feet down, it's double that. 60, treble. At a mile, it's 30 hundredweight, a ton and a half, Stevens. A ton and a half to the square inch, and the ocean where he's going is 5 miles deep." "Sounds a lot," said Stevens, "but it's jolly thick steel." The lieutenant made no answer, but resumed his pine splinter. The object of their conversation was a huge ball of steel, having an exterior diameter of perhaps 9 feet. It looked like the shot for some titanic piece of artillery. It was elaborately nested in a monstrous scaffolding built into the framework of the vessel, and the gigantic spars that were presently to sling it overboard gave the stern of the ship an appearance that had raised the curiosity of every decent sailor who had sighted it from the Pool of London to the Tropic of Capricorn. In 2 places, one above the other, the steel gave place to a couple of circular windows of enormously thick glass, and one of these, set in a steel frame of great solidity, was now partially unscrewed. Both the men had seen the interior of this globe for the first time that morning. It was elaborately padded with air cushions, with little studs sunk between bulging pillows to work the simple mechanism of the affair. Everything was elaborately padded, even the Myers apparatus, which was to absorb carbonic acid and replace the oxygen inspired by its tenant, when he had crept in by the glass manhole and had been screwed in. It was so elaborately padded that a man might have been fired from a gun in it with perfect safety. And it had need to be, for presently a man was to crawl in through the glass manhole, to be screwed up tightly, and to be flung overboard, and to sink down, down, down for 5 miles, even as the lieutenant said. "It's my opinion," said the lieutenant, "that that glass will simply bend in and smash under a pressure of that sort." "If the glass did break in," said Stevens, "what then?" "The water would shoot in like a jet of iron. Have you ever felt a straight jet of high-pressure water? It would hit as hard as a bullet. It would simply smash him." "And the globe?" "Would just give out a few little bubbles, and it would settle down comfortably against the Day of Judgment, among the oozes and the bottom clay, with poor Elstead spread over his own smashed cushions like butter over bread." "Having a look at the jigger?" said a voice, and Elstead stood between them, spick and span in white. "What's that about bread and butter, Weybridge? Grumbling as usual about the insufficient pay of naval officers? It won't be more than a day now before I start. We are to get the slings ready today. This clean sky and gentle swell is just the kind of thing for swinging off a dozen tons of lead and iron, isn't it?" "It won't affect you much," said Weybridge. "No. 70 or 80 feet down, and I shall be there in a dozen seconds. There's not a particle moving, though the wind shriek itself hoarse up above and the water lift halfway to the clouds. No, down there—" He moved to the side of the ship, and the other 2 followed him. All 3 leant forward on their elbows and stared down into the yellow-green water. "Peace," said Elstead, finishing his thought aloud. "I wouldn't go down in that confounded thing," said Weybridge, "for 20,000 pounds. "Cheerful chap you are," said Elstead, and spat sociably at a bubble below. "I don't understand yet how you mean to work the thing," said Stevens. "In the first place, I'm screwed into the sphere," said Elstead, "and when I've turned the electric light off and on 3 times to show I'm cheerful, I'm slung out over the stern by that crane, with all those big lead sinkers slung below me. The top lead weight has a roller, carrying 100 fathoms of strong cord rolled up, and that's all that joins the sinkers to the sphere, except the slings that will be cut when the affair is dropped. Through each of these lead weights you notice there's a hole, and an iron rod will be run through that and will project 6 feet on the lower side. If that rod is rammed up from below, it knocks up a lever and sets the clockwork in motion at the side of the cylinder on which the cord winds. "But why the cord?" asked Stevens. "Why not fasten the weights directly to the sphere?" "Because of the smash down below. The whole affair will go rushing down mile after mile at a headlong pace at last. It had been knocked to pieces at the bottom if it wasn't for that cord. But the weights will hit the bottom, and directly they do, the buoyancy of the sphere will come into play. It'll go on sinking, slower and slower, come to a stop at last, and then begin to float upward again. That's where the clockwork comes in. Directly the weights smash against the sea bottom, the rod will be knocked through, and will kick up the clockwork, and the cord will be rewound on the reel. I shall be lugged down to the sea bottom, and there I shall stay for half an hour, with the electric lights on, looking about me. Then the clockwork will release a spring knife. The cord will be cut, and up I shall rush again like a soda water bubble. The cord itself will help the flotation." "And if you should chance to hit a ship," said Weybridge. "I should come up at such a pace I should go clean through it," said Elstead. "Ha! Like a cannonball. You needn't worry about that." They had swung Elstead overboard by 11 o'clock. The day was serenely bright and calm, with the horizon lost in haze. The electric glare in the little upper compartment beamed cheerfully 3 times. Then they let him down slowly to the surface of the water, and a sailor in the stern chains hung ready to cut the tackle that held the lead weights and the sphere together. The globe, which had looked so large on deck, looked the smallest thing conceivable under the stern of the ship. It rolled a little, and its 2 dark windows, which floated uppermost, seemed like eyes turned up in round wonderment at the people who crowded the rail. A voice wondered how Elstead liked the rolling. "Are you ready?" called the commander. "Aye, aye, sir." "Then let it go." The rope of the tackle tightened against the blade and was cut, and an eddy rolled over the globe in a grotesquely helpless fashion. It seemed to be stationary for a moment, to grow rapidly smaller, and then the water closed over it, and it became visible, enlarged by refraction and dimmer, below the surface. Before one could count 3, it had disappeared. There was a flicker of white light far down in the water that diminished to a speck and vanished. Then there was nothing but a depth of water going down into blackness, through which a shark was swimming. Then suddenly the screw of the cruiser began to rotate. The water was crickled, the shark disappeared in a wrinkled confusion, and a torrent of foam rushed across the crystalline clearness that had swallowed up Elstead. "What's the idea?" said one A.B. to another. "We're going to lay off a couple of miles, fear he should hit us when he comes up." The ship steamed slowly to her new position. Aboard her, almost everyone who was unoccupied remained watching the breathing swell into which the sphere had sunk. The December sun was now high in the sky, and the heat very considerable. "He'll be cold enough down there," said Weybridge. "They say that below a certain depth, sea water is always just about freezing." "Where'll he come up?" said Stevens. "I've lost my bearings." "That's the spot," said the commander, who prided himself on his omniscience. He extended a precise finger southeastward. "And this, I reckon, is pretty nearly the moment," he said. "He's been 35 minutes. "How long does it take to reach the bottom of the ocean?" said Stevens. "For a depth of 5 miles, and reckoning as we did an acceleration of 2 feet per second, both ways, just about 3/4 of a minute." "Then he's overdue," said Weybridge. "Pretty nearly," said the commander. "I suppose it takes a few minutes for that cord of his to wind in." "Oh, I forgot that," said Weybridge. And then began the suspense. A minute slowly dragged itself out, and no sphere shot out of the water. Another followed, and nothing broke the low, oily swell. The sailors explained to one another that little point about the winding in of the cord. The rigging was dotted with expectant faces. "Come up, Elstead," called one hairy-chested salt, and the others caught it up and shouted as though they were waiting for the curtain of a theatre to rise. The commander glanced irritably at them. "Of course, if the acceleration is less than 2, he said, "he'll be all the longer. We aren't absolutely certain that was the proper figure. I'm no slavish believer in calculations." Stevens agreed concisely. No one on the quarterdeck spoke for a couple of minutes. Then Stevens' watch case clicked. When, 21 minutes after the sun reached the zenith, They were still waiting for the globe to reappear. Not a man aboard had dared to whisper that hope was dead. It was Weybridge who did so first. "I always distrusted that window," he said quite suddenly to Stevens. "Good grief," said Stevens. "You don't think—" "Well," said Weybridge, and left the rest to his imagination. "I'm no great believer in calculations myself," said the commander, "so I'm not altogether without hope yet." And at midnight, the gunboat was steaming in a spiral round the spot where the globe had sunk, and the white beam of the electric light fled and halted and swept discontentedly onward again over the waste of phosphorescent waters under the little stars. "If his window hasn't burst and smashed him," said Weybridge, "then it's a cursed sight worse, for his clockwork's gone wrong, and he's alive now, 5 miles under our feet, down there in the cold and dark, anchored in that little bubble of his, where never a ray of light has shone or a human being lived since the waters were gathered together. He's there without food, feeling hungry and thirsty and scared, wondering whether he'll starve or stifle. Which will it be?" Suddenly he stopped, turned, called, "Elstead, ahoy!" and went at a run to Lindley and the searchlight. "I saw him," he said. "Starboard there. His light's on and he's just shot out of the water. Bring the light round. We ought to see him drifting when he lifts on the swell." But they could not pick up the explorer until dawn. Then they almost ran him down. The crane was swung out, and a boat's crew hooked the chain to the sphere. When they had shipped the sphere, they unscrewed the manhole. There was no answer to their eager questions, and no sound of movement within. Elstead seemed to be lying motionless, crumpled up in the bottom of the globe. The ship's doctor crawled in and lifted him out to the men outside. He was not dead, they found, but in a state of absolute nervous collapse, and besides cruelly bruised. For some days he had to lie perfectly still. It was a week before he could tell his experiences. Almost his first words were that he was going down again. The sphere would have to be altered, he said, in order to allow him to throw off the cord if need be, and that was all. He had had the most marvellous experience. "You thought I should find nothing but ooze," he said. "You laughed at my explorations, and I've discovered a new world." He told his story in disconnected fragments, and chiefly from the wrong end, so that it is impossible to retell it in his words, but what follows is the narrative of his experience. "It began atrociously," he said. "Before the cord ran out, the thing kept rolling over. He felt like a frog in a football. Suddenly the swaying ceased, the globe righted, and when he had picked himself up, he saw the water all about him greeny-blue, with an attenuated light filtering down from above, and a shoal of little floating things went rushing up past him, as it seemed to him, towards the light. And even as he looked, it grew darker and darker, until the water above was as dark as the midnight sky. In 50 seconds, everything was as black as night outside, except where the beam from his light struck through the waters and picked out every now and then some fish or scrap of sinking matter. They flashed by too fast for him to see what they were. Once he thinks he passed a shark. And then the sphere began to get hot by friction against the water. They had underestimated this, it seems. Then suddenly the floor of the sphere seemed to press against his feet. The window had not cracked, nothing had given, and he knew that the dangers of sinking, at any rate, were over. In another minute or so, he would be on the floor of the abyss. He thought, he said, of Stevens and Weybridge, and the rest of them 5 miles overhead, higher to him than the very highest clouds that ever floated over land are to us, steaming slowly, and staring down and wondering what had happened to him. He peered out of the window. Outside there was a heavy blackness, as black velvet, except where the electric light pierced the empty water and showed the colour of it, a yellow-green. As he went on down, he noticed that the water became of a pallid colour, probably due to the clouds of ooze and mud that the impact of his leaden sinkers had disturbed. By the time he was drawn down to the lead weights, he was in a dense fog of white that his electric light failed altogether to pierce for more than a few yards, and many minutes elapsed before the hanging sheets of sediment subsided to any extent. Then, lit by his light and by the transient phosphorescence of a distant shoal of fishes, he was able to see, under the huge blackness of the superincumbent water, an undulating expanse of greyish-white ooze, broken here and there by tangled thickets of a growth of sea lilies, waving hungry tentacles in the air. Then suddenly the hovering swarm of little fishes veered about and came towards him, as a flight of starlings might do. They passed over him like a phosphorescent snow, and then he saw behind them some larger creature advancing towards the sphere. At first he could see it only dimly, a faintly moving figure, remotely suggestive of a walking man. And then it came into the spray of light that the lamp shot out. As the glare struck it, it shut its eyes, dazzled. He stared in rigid astonishment. It was a strange, vertebrated animal. Its dark purple head was dimly suggestive of a chameleon, but it had such a high forehead and such a brain case as no reptile ever displayed before. The vertical pitch of its face gave it a most extraordinary resemblance to a human being. Two large and protruding eyes projected from sockets in chameleon fashion, and it had a broad reptilian mouth with horny lips beneath its little nostrils. In the position of the ears were two huge gill covers. But the humanity of the face was not the most extraordinary thing about the creature. It was a biped. Its almost globular body was poised on a tripod of two frog-like legs and a long, thick tail, and its forelimbs, which grotesquely caricatured the human hand, much as a frog's do, carried a long shaft of bone tipped with copper. The colour of the creature was variegated. Its head, hands, and legs were purple, but its skin, which hung loosely upon it, even as clothes might do, was a phosphorescent grey. And it stood there, blinded by the light. At last, this unknown creature of the abyss blinked its eyes open, and shading them with its disengaged hand, opened its mouth and gave vent to a shouting noise, articulate almost as speech might be, that penetrated even the steel case and padded jacket of the sphere. In another moment, something soft dabbed upon the steel, and the globe swayed. Then the shouting was repeated, and it seemed to him that a distant echo answered it. The dabbing recurred, and the whole globe swayed and ground against the spindle over which the wire was rolled. He stood in the blackness and peered out into the everlasting night of the abyss, and presently he saw, very faint and remote, other phosphorescent quasi-human forms hurrying towards him. The sphere twisted and then threw him down. He heard shouts like shouts of surprise, and when he rose to his feet, he saw two pairs of stalked eyes peering into the lower window and reflecting his light. In another moment, hands were dabbing vigorously at his steel casing, and there was a sound, horrible enough in his position, of the metal protection of the clockwork being vigorously hammered. That, indeed, sent his heart into his mouth, for if these strange creatures succeeded in stopping that, his release would never occur. Scarcely had he thought as much when he felt the sphere spinning slowly and rocking, and it seemed to him that it was also being drawn through the water. By crouching close to the window, he saw, faint and remote across the undulations of the submarine plain, a broad horizon of pale luminosity that extended this way and that way as far as the range of his little window permitted him to see. To this he was being towed at the end of his cord, as a balloon might be towed by men out of the open country into a town. He approached it very slowly, and very slowly the dim irradiation was gathered together into more definite shapes. It was nearly 5 o'clock before he came over this luminous area, and by that time he could make out an arrangement suggestive of streets and houses, grouped about a vast, roofless erection that was grotesquely suggestive of a ruined abbey. It was spread out like a map below him. The houses were all roofless enclosures of walls, and their substance being, as he afterwards saw, of phosphorescent bones, gave the place an appearance as if it were built of drowned moonshine. In the open spaces of the place he could see a stirring movement, as of crowds of people, but he was too many fathoms above them to distinguish the individuals in those crowds. Then slowly they pulled him down, and as they did so, he perceived that at several points below him, in broad open spaces, were forms like the encrusted shapes of ships. Slowly and surely he was drawn down, and the forms below him became brighter, clearer, more distinct. He was being pulled down, he perceived, towards the large building in the centre of the town. And then the walls of the great building rose about him silently and hid the city from his eyes. And such walls they were, of waterlogged wood and twisted wire rope, and iron spars and copper, and the bones and skulls of dead men. The skulls ran in zigzag lines and spirals and fantastic curves over the buildings, and in and out of their eye sockets, and over the whole surface of the place, lurked and played a multitude of silvery little fishes. Suddenly his ears were filled with a low shouting and a noise like the violent blowing of horns, and this gave place to a fantastic chant. Down the sphere sank, and at last he came to rest, as it seemed, on a kind of altar that stood in the centre of the place. And now he was at such a level that he could see these strange people of the abyss plainly once more. To his astonishment, he perceived that they were prostrating themselves before him, all save one, dressed as it seemed in a robe of placoid scales, and crowned with a luminous diadem, who stood with his reptilian mouth opening and shutting, as though he led the chanting of the worshippers. And thus they continued worshipping him, without rest or intermission, for a space of 3 hours. Most circumstantial was Elsted's account of his astounding city and its people, these people of perpetual night who have never seen sun or moon or stars, green vegetation, nor any living, air-breathing creatures. Startling as is his story, it is yet more startling to find that certain scientific men of eminence find nothing incredible in it. They tell me they see no reason why intelligent, water-breathing, vertebrated creatures inured to a low temperature and enormous pressure might not live upon the bottom of the deep sea, and quite unsuspected by us. We should be known to them, however, as strange meteoric creatures, wont to fall catastrophically dead out of the mysterious blackness of their watery sky. And not only we ourselves, but our ships, our metals, our appliances, would come raining down out of the night. Sometimes sinking things would smite down and crush them, as if it were the judgment of some unseen power. The manner of his release Elsted does not understand, but to judge by the end of cord that hung from the sphere, it had been cut through by rubbing against the edge of the altar. Abruptly, the sphere rolled over, and he swept up out of their world. He must have torn out of their sight as a hydrogen bubble hastens upward from our air. And that is the substance of the extraordinary story that Elsted related, in fragments, to the officers of the cruiser. He promised to write it all down at a later date. His mind was chiefly occupied with the improvement of his apparatus, which was effected at Rio. It remains only to tell that on February the 2nd, 1896, he made his second descent into the ocean abyss with the improvements his first experience suggested. What happened, we shall never know, for he never returned.
In the Abyss by H.G. Wells was read by Timothy Kitely. It was adapted by Neville Teller, and the producer was Pamela Howe.
Welcome to GoldenAgeRadio.com, rumble.com/C/GAR. Brand new episodes every week. Visit VeteransRadioMinistry.com to listen to more episodes like this.
The Sea Raiders by H.G. Wells. Until the extraordinary affair at Sidmouth, the peculiar species Haploteuthis ferox was known to science only generically, on the strength of a half-digested tentacle obtained near the Azores, and a decaying body, pecked by birds and nibbled by fish, found early in 1896 by Mr. Jennings near Land's End. In no department of zoological science, indeed, are we quite so much in the dark as with regard to the deep-sea cephalopods. it would seem that these large and agile creatures, living in the middle depths of the sea, must, to a large extent, forever remain unknown to us, since underwater they are too nimble for nets, and it is only by such rare unlooked-for accidents that specimens can be obtained. In the case of Haploteuthis ferox, for instance, we are still altogether ignorant of its habitat, as ignorant as we are of the breeding ground of the herring or the seaways of the salmon. And zoologists are altogether at a loss to account for its sudden appearance on our coast. Possibly it was the stress of a hunger migration that drove it hither out of the deep, but it will be perhaps better to avoid necessarily inconclusive discussion, and to proceed at once with our narrative. The first human being to set eyes upon a living Haploteuthis, the first human being to survive, that is, for there can be little doubt now that the wave of bathing fatalities and boating accidents that travelled along the coast of Cornwall and Devon in early May was due to this cause, was a retired tea dealer of the name of Fison, who was stopping at a Sidmouth boarding-house. It was in the afternoon, and he was walking along the cliff path between Sidmouth and Ladram Bay. The cliffs in this direction are very high, but down the red face of them in one place a kind of ladder staircase has been made. He was near this when his attention was attracted by what at first he thought to be a cluster of birds struggling over a fragment of food that caught the sunlight and glistened pinkish-white. The tide was right out, and this object was not only far below him, but remote across a broad waste of rock reefs covered with dark seaweed, and interspersed with silvery, shining tidal pools. And he was, moreover, dazzled by the brightness of the further water. In a minute, regarding this again, he perceived that his judgment was in fault, for over this struggle circled a number of birds, jackdaws and gulls for the most part, the latter gleaming blindingly when the sunlight smote their wings, and they seemed minute in comparison with it. And his curiosity was, perhaps, aroused all the more strongly, because of his first insufficient explanations. As he had nothing better to do than amuse himself, he decided to make this object, whatever it was, the goal of his afternoon walk, instead of Ladram Bay, conceiving it might perhaps be a great fish of some sort, stranded by some chance, and flapping about in its distress. So he hurried down the long steep ladder, stopping at intervals of 30 feet or so to take breath, and scanned the mysterious movement. At the foot of the cliff he was, of course, nearer his object than he had been, but, on the other hand, it now came up against the incandescent sky, beneath the sun, so as to seem dark and indistinct. Whatever was pinkish of it was now hidden by a skerry of weedy boulders, but he perceived that it was made up of 7 rounded bodies, distinct or connected, and that the birds kept up a constant croaking and screaming, but seemed afraid to approach it too closely. Mr. Fison, torn by curiosity, began picking his way across the wave-worn rocks, and, finding the wet seaweed that covered them thickly rendered them extremely slippery, he stopped, removed his shoes and socks, and coiled his trousers above his knees. His object was, of course, merely to avoid stumbling into the rocky pools about him, and perhaps he was rather glad, as all men are, of an excuse to resume, even for a moment, the sensations of his boyhood. At any rate, it is to this, no doubt, that he owes his life. He approached his mark with all the assurance which the absolute security of this country against all forms of animal life gives its inhabitants. The round bodies moved to and fro, but it was only when he surmounted the skerry of boulders I have mentioned that he realized the horrible nature of the discovery. It came upon him with some suddenness. The rounded bodies fell apart as he came into sight over the ridge, and displayed the pinkish object to be the partially devoured body of a human being, but whether of a man or woman he was unable to say. And the rounded bodies were new and ghastly-looking creatures, in shape somewhat resembling an octopus, and with huge and very long and flexible tentacles coiled copiously on the ground. The skin had a glistening texture, unpleasant to see, like shiny leather. The downward bend of the tentacle-surrounded mouth, the curious excrescence at the bend, The tentacles and the large intelligent eyes gave the creatures a grotesque suggestion of a face. They were the size of a fair-sized swine about the body, and the tentacles seemed to him to be many feet in length. There were, he thinks, 7 or 8 at least of these creatures. 20 yards beyond them, amid the surf of the now returning tide, 2 others were emerging from the sea. Their bodies lay flatly on the rocks, and their eyes regarded him with evil interest. But it does not appear that Mr. Fison was afraid, or that he realized he was in any danger. Possibly his confidence is to be ascribed to the limpness of their attitudes. But he was horrified, of course, and intensely excited and indignant at such revolting creatures preying on human flesh. He thought they had chanced upon a drowned body. He shouted to them, with the idea of driving them off, and, finding that they did not budge, cast about him, picked up a big rounded lump of rock, and flung it at one. And then, slowly uncoiling their tentacles, they all began moving towards him, creeping at first deliberately, and making a soft purring sound to each other. In a moment Mr. Fison realized that he was in danger. He shouted again, threw both his boots off, and started off with a leap forthwith. 20 yards off he stopped and faced about, judging them slow, and behold, the tentacles of their leader were already pouring over the rocky ridge on which he had just been standing. At that he shouted again, but this time not threatening, but a cry of dismay, and began jumping, striding, slipping, wading across the uneven expanse between him and the beach. The tall red cliffs seemed suddenly a vast distance, and he saw, as though they were creatures in another world, 2 minute workmen engaged in the repair of the ladderway, and little suspecting the race for life that was beginning below them. At one time he could hear the creatures splashing in the pools not a dozen feet behind him, and once he slipped and almost fell. They chased him to the very foot of the cliffs, and desisted only when he had been joined by the workmen at the foot of the ladderway up the cliff. All 3 of the men pelted them with stones for a time, then hurried to the cliff top and along the path towards Sidmouth, to secure assistance and a boat, and to rescue the desecrated body from the clutches of these abominable creatures. And, as if he had not already been in sufficient peril that day, Mr. Fison went with the boat to point out the exact spot of his adventure. As the tide was down, it required a considerable detour to reach the spot, and when at last they came off the ladderway, the mangled body had disappeared. The water was now running in, submerging first one slab of slimy rock and then another, and the 4 men in the boat, the workmen, that is, the boatman and Mr. Fison, now turned their attention from the bearings offshore to the water beneath the keel. At first they could see little below them, save a dark jungle of laminaria, with an occasional darting fish. Their minds were set on adventure, and they expressed their disappointment freely. But presently they saw one of the monsters swimming through the water seaward, with a curious rolling motion that suggested to Mr. Fison the spinning roll of a captive balloon. Almost immediately after, the waving streamers of laminaria were extraordinarily perturbed, parted for a moment, and 3 of these beasts became darkly visible, struggling for what was probably some fragment of the drowned man. In a moment the copious olive-green ribbons had poured again over this writhing group. At that, all 4 men, greatly excited, began beating the water with oars and shouting, and immediately they saw a tumultuous movement among the weeds. They desisted to see more clearly, and as soon as the water was smooth, they saw, as it seemed to them, the whole sea bottom among the weeds set with eyes. "Ugly swine!" cried one of the men. "Why, there's dozens!" And forthwith the things began to rise through the water about them. Mr. Fison has since described to the writer this startling eruption out of the waving laminaria meadows. To him it seemed to occupy a considerable time, but it is probable that really it was an affair of a few seconds only. For a time nothing but eyes, and then he speaks of tentacles streaming out and parting the weed fronds this way and that. Then these things growing larger, until at last the bottom was hidden by their intercoiling forms, and the tips of tentacles rose darkly here and there into the air above the swell of the waters. One came boldly to the side of the boat, and, clinging to this with 3 of its sucker-set tentacles, threw 4 others over the gunwale, as if with an intention either of oversetting the boat or of clambering into it. Mr. Fison at once caught up the boat-hook and, jabbing furiously at the soft tentacles, forced it to desist. He was struck in the back and almost pitched overboard by the boatman, who was using his oar to resist a similar attack on the other side of the boat. But the tentacles on either side at once relaxed their hold at this, slid out of sight, and splashed into the water. "We'd better get out of this," said Mr. Fison, who was trembling violently. He went to the tiller, while the boatman and one of the workmen seated themselves and began rowing. The other workman stood up in the forepart of the boat, with the boat-hook, ready to strike at any more tentacles that might appear. Nothing else seems to have been said. In a hushed, scared mood, with faces white and drawn, they set about escaping from the position into which they had so recklessly blundered. But the oars had scarcely dropped into the water before dark, tapering, serpentine ropes had bound them and were about the rudder. And, creeping up the sides of the boat with a looping motion, came the suckers again. The men gripped their oars and pulled, but it was like trying to move a boat in a floating raft of weeds. "Help here!" cried the boatman, and Mr. Fison and the second workman rushed to help lug at the oar. Then the man with the boat-hook, his name was Ewan, or Yuen, sprang up with a curse and began striking downward over the side as far as he could reach at the bank of tentacles that now clustered along the boat's bottom. And at the same time the 2 rowers stood up to get a better purchase for the recovery of their oars. The boatman handed his to Mr. Fison, who lugged desperately, and meanwhile the boatman opened a big clasp-knife, and, leaning over the side of the boat, began hacking at the spiring arms upon the oar-shaft. Mr. Fison, staggering with the quivering rocking of the boat, his teeth set, his breath coming short, and the veins starting on his hands as he pulled his oar, suddenly cast his eyes seaward. And there, not 50 yards off, across the long rollers of the incoming tide, was a large boat standing in towards them, with 3 women and a little child in it. A boatman was rowing, and a little man in a pink-ribboned straw hat and whites stood in the stern, hailing them. For a moment, of course, Mr. Fison thought of help, and then he thought of the child. He abandoned his oar forthwith, threw up his arms in a frantic gesture, and screamed to the party in the boat to keep away, for God's sake. It says much for the modesty and courage of Mr. Fison that he does not seem to be aware that there was any quality of heroism in his action at this juncture. The oar he had abandoned was at once drawn under, and presently reappeared, floating about 20 yards away. At the same moment Mr. Fison felt the boat under him lurch violently, and a hoarse scream, a prolonged cry of terror from Hill, the boatman, caused him to forget the party of excursionists altogether. He turned and saw Hill crouching by the forward rollock, his face convulsed with terror, and his right arm over the side and drawn tightly down. He gave now a succession of short, sharp cries. "Oh! Oh! Oh! Oh!" Mr. Fison believes that he must have been hacking at the tentacles below the waterline, and have been grasped by them, but of course it is quite impossible to say now certainly what had happened. The boat was heeling over, so that the gunwale was within 10 inches of the water, and both Ewan and the other labourer were striking down into the water with oar and boat-hook on either side of Hill's arm. Mr. Fison instinctively placed himself to counterpoise them. Then Hill, who was a burly, powerful man, made a strenuous effort, and rose almost to a standing position. He lifted his arm, indeed, clean out of the water. Hanging to it was a complicated tangle of brown ropes, and the eyes of one of the brutes that had hold of him, glaring straight and resolute, showed momentarily above the surface. The boat heeled more and more, and the green-brown water came pouring in a cascade over the side. Then Hill slipped and fell with his ribs across the side, and his arm and the mass of tentacles about it splashed back into the water. He rolled over, His boot kicked Mr. Fison's knee as that gentleman rushed forward to seize him, and in another moment fresh tentacles had whipped about his waist and neck, and, after a brief, convulsive struggle in which the boat was nearly capsized, Hill was lugged overboard. The boat righted with a violent jerk that all but sent Mr. Fison over the other side, and hid the struggle in the water from his eyes. He stood staggering to recover his balance for a moment, and as he did so, he became aware that the struggle and the inflowing tide had carried them close upon the weedy rocks again. In a moment Mr. Fison seized the oar from Ewan, gave one vigorous stroke, then, dropping it, ran to the bows and leapt. He felt his feet slide over the rock, and, by a frantic effort, leapt again towards a further mass. He stumbled over this, came to his knees, and rose again. "Look out!" cried someone, and a large drab body struck him. He was knocked flat into a tidal pool by one of the workmen, and as he went down he heard smothered, choking cries that he believed at the time came from Hill. Then he found himself marvelling at the shrillness and variety of Hill's voice. Someone jumped over him, and a curving rush of foamy water poured over him, and passed. He scrambled to his feet, dripping, and, without looking seaward, ran as fast as his terror would let him shoreward. Before him, over the flat space of scattered rock, stumbled the two workmen, one a dozen yards in front of the other. He looked over his shoulder at last, and, seeing that he was not pursued, faced about. He was astonished. From the moment of the rising of the cephalopods out of the water, he had been acting too swiftly to fully comprehend his actions. Now it seemed to him as if he had suddenly jumped out of an evil dream. For there were the sky, cloudless and blazing with the afternoon sun, the sea weltering under its pitiless brightness, the soft, creamy foam of the breaking water, and the low, long, dark ridges of rock. The righted boat floated, rising and falling gently on the swell about a dozen yards from the shore. Hill and the monsters, all the stress and tumult of that fierce fight for life, had vanished as though they had never been. Mr. Fison's heart was beating violently. He was throbbing to the fingertips, and his breath came deep. There was something missing. For some seconds he could not think clearly enough what this might be. Sun, sky, sea, rocks, what was it? Then he remembered the boatload of excursionists. It had vanished. He wondered whether he had imagined it. He turned and saw the two workmen standing side by side under the projecting masses of the tall pink cliffs. He hesitated whether he should make one last attempt to save the man Hill. His physical excitement seemed to desert him suddenly, and leave him aimless and helpless. He turned shoreward, stumbling and wading towards his two companions. He looked back again, and there were now two boats floating, and the one furthest out to sea pitched clumsily, bottom upward. So it was that Haploteuthis ferox made its appearance upon the Devonshire coast. So far this has been its most serious aggression. Mr. Fison's account, taken together with the wave of boating and bathing casualties to which I have already alluded, and the absence of fish from the Cornish coast that year, points clearly to a shoal of these voracious deep-sea monsters prowling slowly along the subtidal coastline. Hunger migration has, I know, been suggested as the force that drove them hither, but for my own part I prefer to believe the alternative theory of Hemsley. Hemsley holds that a pack or shoal of these creatures may have become enamoured of human flesh by the accident of a foundered ship sinking among them, and have wandered in search of it out of their accustomed zone, first waylaying and following ships, and so coming to our shores in the wake of the Atlantic traffic. It would seem that the appetites of the shoal were satisfied by the catch of 11 people. For so far as can be ascertained, there were 10 people in the second boat, and certainly these creatures gave no further signs of their presence off Sidmouth that day. The coast between Seaton and Budleigh Salterton was patrolled all that evening and night by 4 preventive service boats, the men in which were armed with harpoons and cutlasses, and as the evening advanced, a number of more or less similarly equipped expeditions, organised by private individuals, joined them. Mr. Fison took no part in any of these expeditions. About midnight, excited hails were heard from a boat about a couple of miles out to sea to the south-east of Sidmouth, and a lantern was seen waving in a strange manner to and fro, up and down. The nearer boats at once hurried towards the alarm. The venturesome occupants of the boat, a seaman, a curate, and 2 schoolboys, had actually seen the monsters passing under their boat. The creatures, it seemed, like most deep-sea organisms, were phosphorescent, and they had been floating 5 fathoms deep or so, like creatures of moonshine through the blackness of the water, their tentacles retracted, and as if asleep, rolling over and over, and moving slowly in a wedge-like formation towards the south-east. We have not the slightest knowledge of the subsequent movements of the shoal, although the whole south-west coast was now alert for it. 2 weeks and 3 days after this Sidmouth affair, a living Haploteuthis came ashore on Calais sands. It was alive, because several witnesses saw its tentacles moving in a convulsive way, but it is probable that it was dying. A gentleman named Pouchet obtained a rifle and shot it. On the 15th of June, a dead Haploteuthis, almost complete, was washed ashore near Torquay. And on the last day of June, Mr. Egbert Kane, an artist bathing near Newlyn, threw up his arms, shrieked, and was drawn under. A friend bathing with him made no attempt to save him, but swam at once for the shore. This is the last fact to tell of this extraordinary raid from the deeper sea. Whether it is really the last of these horrible creatures, it is as yet premature to say. But it is believed, and certainly to be hoped, that they have returned now, and returned for good, to the sunless depths of the middle seas, out of which they have so strangely and so mysteriously arisen.
The Sea Raiders by H.G. Wells was read by Robert Bathurst. The producer was Gemma Jenkins.
Welcome to GoldenAgeRadio.com, rumble.com/C/GAR. Brand new episodes every week. Visit VeteransRadioMinistry.com to listen to more episodes like this.
Staring vacantly. Presently he was moved by a sense of my observation, and looked up at me. I feigned to read. I feared I had unwittingly embarrassed him, and in a moment I was surprised to find him speaking. "I beg your pardon?" "That book," he repeated, pointing a lean finger. "It's about dreams." "Obviously," I answered, for it was Fortnum Roscoe's Dream States, and the title was on the cover. He hung silent for a space, as if he sought words. "Yes," he said at last, "but they tell you nothing." I looked a little more attentively at his face. "There are dreams," he said, "and dreams." That sort of proposition I never dispute. "I suppose," he hesitated, "do you ever dream? I mean, vividly?" "I dream very little," I answered. "Your dreams don't mix with your memories? You don't find yourself in doubt, did this happen or did it not?" "Well, hardly ever, except just for a momentary hesitation now and then." "Does he say—" he indicated the book. "Says it happens at times, and gives the usual explanation about intensity of impression and the like to account for its not happening as a rule. I suppose you know something of these theories?" "Very little, except that they are wrong." His emaciated hand played with the strap of the window for a time. I prepared to resume reading, and that seemed to precipitate his next remark. He leant forward, almost as though he would touch me. "Isn't there something called consecutive dreaming, that goes on night after night?" "I believe there is. There are cases given in most books on mental trouble." "Mental trouble? Yes, I dare say there are. It's the right place for them. But what I mean," he looked at his bony knuckles, "is that sort of thing always dreaming, or is it something else?" I should have snubbed his persistent conversation but for the drawn anxiety of his face. I remember now the look of his faded eyes and the lids red-stained. Perhaps you know that look. "I'm not just arguing about a matter of opinion," he said. "The thing's killing me." "Dreams?" "If you call them dreams. Night after night. Vivid, so vivid. This," he indicated the landscape that went streaming by the window, "seems unreal in comparison. I can scarcely remember who I am." He paused. "Even now." "The dream is always the same, do you mean?" I asked. "It's over." "You mean?" "I died." "Died?" "Smashed and killed. And now so much of me as that dream was is dead. I dreamt I was another man, you know, living in a different part of the world and in a different time. Night after night I woke into that other life. Fresh scenes and fresh happenings, until I came upon the last." "When you died?" "Yeah, when I died." "And since then?" "No," he said. "Oh, thank God. That was the end of the dream." It was clear I was in for this dream, and after all I had an hour before me. The light was fading fast, and Fortnum Roscoe has a dreary way with him. "Living in a different time," I said. "Do you mean in some different age?" "Yes." "Past?" "No. To come. To come." "The year 3000, for example?" "I don't know what year it was. I did when I was dreaming, but not now. Not now that I'm awake. There's lots of things I've forgotten since I woke out of these dreams. They called the year differently from our way of calling the year. What did they call it?" He put his hand to his forehead. "No," said he. "I forget." For a moment I feared he did not mean to tell me his dream. As a rule, I hate people who tell their dreams, but this struck me differently. I proffered assistance even. "It began," I suggested. "It was vivid from the first. I seemed to wake up in it suddenly. And it's curious that in these dreams I'm speaking of, I never remembered this life I am living now. It seemed as if the dream life was enough while it lasted. I don't remember anything clearly until I found myself sitting in a sort of loggia looking out over the sea. I had been dozing, and suddenly I woke up, fresh and vivid, not a bit dreamlike, because the girl had stopped fanning me." "The girl?" "Yes, the girl. You must not interrupt, or you will put me out." He stopped abruptly. "You won't think I'm mad," he said. "No," I answered. Tell me your dream." I woke up, I say, because the girl had stopped fanning me. I was not surprised to find myself there, or anything of that sort, you understand. Whatever memory I had of this life, this 19th century life, faded as I woke, vanished like a dream. I knew all about myself, knew that my name was no longer Cooper, but Hedon, and all about my position in the world. I've forgotten a lot since I woke. There's a want of connection, but it was all quite clear and matter-of-fact then. This seems bosh to you? "No, no," I cried. "Go on. Tell me what this loggia was like." It faced south. It was small. It was all in shadow except the semicircle above the balcony that showed the sky and sea and the corner where the girl stood. I was on a couch. It was a metal couch with light striped cushions, and the girl was leaning over the balcony with her back to me. The light of the sunrise fell on her ear and cheek, her pretty white neck and the little curls that nestled there, and her white shoulder were in the sun, and all the grace of her body was in the cool blue shadow. She was dressed, how can I describe it? It was easy and flowing, and it came to me how beautiful and desirable she was, as though I had never seen her before. When at last I sighed and raised myself upon my arm, she turned her face to me. He stopped. I have lived 53 years in this world. I have had mother, sisters, friends, wife and daughters. All their faces, the play of their faces, I know. But the face of this girl It is much more real to me. I can bring it back into memory so that I see it again. I could draw it or paint it." He stopped, but I said nothing. "The face of a dream. She was beautiful. Not that beauty which is terrible, cold, and worshipful, like the beauty of a saint, nor that beauty that stirs fierce passions, but a sort of radiation, sweet lips that softened into smiles, and grave grey eyes." He stopped, and his face was downcast and hidden. Then he looked up at me and went on, making no further attempt to disguise his absolute belief in the reality of his story. "You see, I had thrown up my plans and ambitions, thrown up all I had ever worked for or desired for her sake. I had been a master man away there in the north, with influence and property and a great reputation, but none of it had seemed worth having beside her. I had come to the place, this city of sunny pleasures, with her, and left all those things to wreck and ruin just to save a last remnant at least of my life. While I had been in love with her before I knew that she had any care for me, before I had imagined she would dare, that we should dare, all my life had seemed vain and hollow, dust and ashes. It was dust and ashes. But it is impossible for one man to tell another these things. It's emotion, it's a tint, a light that comes and goes. Only while it's there, everything changes, everything. The thing is, I came away and left them in their crisis to do what they could." "Left whom?" I asked, puzzled. "The people up in the north there. You see, in this dream, anyhow, I had been a big man. The sort of man men come to trust in, to group themselves about. Millions of men who had never seen me were ready to do things and risk things because of their confidence in me. I had been playing that game for years, that vague, monstrous political game amidst intrigues and betrayals, speech and agitation. It was a vast, weltering world, and at last I had a sort of leadership against the gang. You know, it was called the gang, a sort of compromise of scoundrelly projects and base ambitions and vast public emotional stupidities and catchwords. The gang that kept the world noisy and blind year by year, and all the while that it was drifting towards infinite disaster. But I can't expect you to understand the shades and complications of the year something or other ahead. I had it all, down to the smallest details, in my dream. I suppose I had been dreaming of it before I awoke. I sat up on the couch and remained looking at the woman and rejoicing that I had come away out of all that tumult and folly and violence before it was too late. After all, I thought, this is life. Love and beauty, desire and delight, are they not worth all those dismal struggles for vague, gigantic ends? And I blamed myself for having ever sought to be a leader when I might have given my days to love. But then, thought I, if I had not spent my early days sternly and austerely, I might have wasted myself upon vain and worthless women, and at the thought all my being went out in love and tenderness to my dear mistress, my dear lady, who had come at last and compelled me to lay that life aside. "You are worth it," I said, speaking without intending her to hear. "You are worth it, my dearest one, worth pride and praise and all things." And at the murmur of my voice, she turned about. "Come and see," she cried. I can hear her now. "Come and see the sunrise upon Monte Solaro." I remember how I sprang to my feet and joined her at the balcony. I noted the sunlight on her face, caressing the lines of her cheeks and neck. How can I describe to you the scene we had before us? We were at Capri. "I have been there," I said. "I have clambered up Monte Solaro and drunk Vero Capri. It's muddy stuff like cider, at the summit." "Ah," said the man with the white face, "then perhaps you can tell me. You will know if this is indeed Capri. For in this life I've never been there. Let me describe it. We were in a little room, hollowed out of the limestone of a sort of cape, very high above the sea. The whole island, you know, was one enormous hotel, complex beyond explaining. And on the other side there were miles of floating hotels and huge floating stages to which the flying machines came. They called it a pleasure city. Of course, there was none of that in your time. Rather, I should say, is none of that now. Well, this room of ours was at the extremity of the cape, so that one could see east and west. Eastward was a great cliff, and beyond it the Isle of the Sirens. When one turned west, distinct and near, was a little bay, a little beach still in shadow. And out of that shadow rose Solaro, straight and tall. Before us, from east to west, stretched the many-tinted sea, all dotted with little sailing boats. And just below us was a rock with an arch worn through it. The blue sea-water broke to green and foam all round the rock, and a galley came gliding out of the arch. "I know that rock," I said. "I was nearly drowned there. It is called the Fariglione." "I Fariglione? Yes, she called it that," answered the man with the white face. "There was some story, but that—" He put his hand to his forehead again. "No," he said. "I forget that story." Well, that is the first thing I remember. The first dream I had, that little shaded room, and the beautiful air and sky, and that dear lady of mine, and how we sat and talked in half-whispers to one another. We talked in whispers, not because there was anyone to hear, but because there was still such a freshness of mind between us that our thoughts were a little frightened, I think, to find themselves at last in words. Presently we were hungry, and we went from our apartment, going by a strange passage with a moving floor, until we came to the great breakfast-room. There was a fountain and music. We sat and ate and smiled at one another, and I would not heed a man who was watching me from a table nearby. And afterwards we went on to the dancing hall. But I cannot describe that hall. The place was enormous, larger than any building you've ever seen, and in one place there was the gate of old Capri, caught in the wall of a gallery high overhead. Light girders, stems and threads of gold burst from the pillars like fountains, streamed like an aurora across the roof, and interlaced like conjuring tricks. All about the great circle for the dancers there were beautiful figures, strange dragons, and intricate and wonderful grotesques bearing lights. And as we went through the throng, the people turned about and looked at us, for all through the world my name and face were known, and how I had suddenly thrown up pride and struggle to come to this place. And they looked also at the lady beside me, though half the story of how at last she had come to me was unknown or mistold. And few of the men who were there, I know, but judged me a happy man, in spite of all the shame and dishonour that had come upon my name. Thousands of beautiful people swarmed about the hall, crowded in galleries, sat in myriad recesses. They were dressed in splendid colours and crowned with flowers. Thousands danced about the great circle beneath the white images of the ancient gods, and glorious processions of youths and maidens came and went. We too danced, not the dreary monotonies of your days, of this time, I mean, but dances that were beautiful, intoxicating. And even now I can see my lady dancing joyously. She danced, you know, with a serious dignity, and yet she was smiling at me and caressing me with her eyes. "The music was different," he murmured. "It went... I cannot describe it, but it was infinitely richer and more varied than any music that has ever come to me awake." And then, it was when we had done dancing, a man came to speak to me. He was a lean, resolute man, very soberly clad for that place, and already I had marked his face watching me in the breakfasting hall, and afterwards, as we went along the passage, I had avoided his eye. But now, as we sat in a little alcove, he came and touched me and spoke to me so that I was forced to listen. And he asked that he might speak to me for a little time apart. "No," I said, "I have no secrets from this lady. What do you want to tell me?" He glanced at her, as though he would almost appeal to her. Then he asked me suddenly if I had heard of a great and avenging declaration that Evesham had made. Now, Evesham had always before been the man next to myself in the leadership of that great party in the north. He was a forcible, hard, and tactless man, and only I had been able to control and soften him. It was on his account, even more than my own, I think, that the others had been so dismayed at my retreat. So this question about what he had done reawakened my old interest in the life I had put aside, just for a moment. "I have taken no heed of any news for many days," I said. "What has Evesham been saying?" And with that the man began, and even I was struck by Evesham's reckless folly. He not only told me of Evesham's speech, but went on to ask counsel and to point out what need they had of me. While he talked, my lady sat a little forward and watched his face and mine. My old habits of scheming and organising reasserted themselves. I could even see myself suddenly returning to the north. And then I thought of my lady. You see, how can I tell you? There were certain peculiarities of our relationship which would render her presence with me impossible. I should have had to leave her. Indeed, I should have had to renounce her clearly and openly if I was to do all that I could do in the north. And the man knew that, even as he talked to her and me, knew it as well as she did, that my steps to duty were, first separation, then abandonment. At the touch of that thought my dream of a return was shattered. I turned on the man suddenly. "What have I to do with these things now? I have done with them. Why cannot you leave me alone? I have ceased to be anything but a private man." "Yes," he answered, "but have you thought? This talk of war, these reckless challenges, these wild aggressions." I stood up. "No," I cried, "I won't hear you." He seemed to consider the possibility of persistence. He looked from me to where the lady sat, regarding us. "War," he said, as if he were speaking to himself, and then slowly turned from me and walked away. I stood, caught in the whirl of thoughts his appeal had set going. I heard my lady's voice. "Dear," she said, "but if they had need of you—" She did not finish her sentence. She let it rest there. I turned to her sweet face, and the balance of my mood swayed and reeled. "They want me only to do the thing they dare not do themselves," I said. "If they distrust Evesham, they must settle with him themselves." "But war," she said. I saw a doubt on her face that I had seen before, a doubt of herself and me. The first shadow of the discovery that, seen strongly and completely, must drive us apart forever. "My dear one," I said, "there will be no war. The age of wars is past. Trust me to know the justice of this case. I have been free to choose my life, and I have chosen this." "But war," she said. I sat down beside her and took her hand in mine. I set myself to drive that doubt away. I lied to her, and in lying to her I also lied to myself. And she was only too ready to believe me, only too ready to forget. Very soon the shadow had gone, and we were hastening to our bathing place in the Grotta del Bovo Marino, where it was our custom to bathe every day. We swam, and then we sat to bask in the sun. Presently I nodded, resting my head against her knee, and she put her hand upon my hair and stroked it softly, and I dozed. And behold, I was awakening, and I was in my own bed in Liverpool, in the life of today. Only for a time I could not believe that all these vivid moments had been no more than a dream. In truth, I could not believe it a dream for all the sobering reality of things about me. I bathed and dressed as it were by habit, and as I shaved I argued why I of all men should leave the woman I loved to go back to politics in the north. Even if Evesham did force the world back to war, what was that to me? Why should I feel the responsibility of a deity for the way the world might go? You know, that is not quite the way I think about affairs, about my real affairs. I'm a solicitor, you know, with a point of view. The vision was so real, you must understand, so utterly unlike a dream, that I kept perpetually recalling little irrelevant details. Even the gilt line that ran about the seat in the alcove where I had talked with the messenger from my deserted party. Have you ever heard of a dream that had a quality like that? So that afterwards you remembered little details you'd forgotten. I thought. I had never noticed the point before, but he was right. Never, I said. That is what you never seem to do with dreams. No, he answered, but that's just what I did. I am a solicitor in Liverpool, and I could not help wondering what the clients and business people I found myself talking to in my office would think if I told them suddenly I was in love with a girl who would be born a couple of 100 years or so hence, and worried about the politics of my great-great-great-grandchildren. I was chiefly busy that day negotiating a 99-year building lease. It was a private builder in a hurry, and he showed a certain want of temper that sent me to bed irritated. That night I had no dream. Something of that intense reality of conviction vanished. I began to feel sure it was a dream. And then it came again. When the dream came again, nearly 4 days later, it was very different. I think it's certain that 4 days had also elapsed in the dream. Many things had happened in the north. I began, I know, with moody musings. Why, in spite of all, should I go back? Go back for all the rest of my days to toil and stress, insults and perpetual dissatisfaction, simply to save hundreds of millions of common people whom I did not love, from the stress and anguish of war and infinite misrule? They all sought their own narrow ends, and why should not I? Why should not I also live as a man? And out of such thoughts her voice summoned me, and I lifted my eyes. I found myself awake and walking. We had come out above the pleasure city. We were near the summit of Monte Solaro and looking towards the bay. It was the late afternoon, and very clear. All across the bay beyond Sorrento were the floating palaces of the pleasure city moored and chained, and northward were the broad floating stages that received the aeroplanes. Aeroplanes fell out of the sky every afternoon, each bringing its thousands of pleasure-seekers from the uttermost parts of the earth to Capri and its delights. But we noticed them only incidentally, because of an unusual sight that evening. 5 war aeroplanes that had long slumbered useless in the arsenals of the Rhine-mouth were manoeuvring now in the eastward sky. Evesham had astonished the world by producing them and others, and sending them to circle here and there. It was the threat material in the great game of bluff he was playing, and it had taken even me by surprise. He was one of those incredibly stupid, energetic people who seemed sent by heaven to create disasters. I remember how we stood upon the headland watching the squadron circling far away, and how I weighed the full meaning of the sight, seeing clearly the way things must go. And I knew I had only to put it to her, and she would have let me go. Only I did not want to go. My will was all the other way about. I had so newly thrown off the incubus of responsibility. I was still so fresh a renegade from duty that the daylight clearness of what I ought to do had no power at all to touch my will. But though this sense of vast neglected duties had no power to draw me, it could make me silent and preoccupied. It robbed the days I had spent of half their brightness, and roused me into dark meditations in the silence of the night. And as I stood and watched Evesham's aeroplanes sweep to and fro, those birds of infinite ill omen, she stood beside me, watching me, perceiving the trouble indeed, her eyes questioning my face, her expression shaded with perplexity. It was the sense of her that roused me from my mood. I turned upon her suddenly and challenged her to race down the mountain slopes. "No," she said, as if I had jarred with her gravity. But I was resolved to end that gravity and make her run. No one can be very sad who is out of breath. And when she stumbled, I ran with my hand beneath her arm. We ran down past a couple of men, who turned back, staring in astonishment at my behaviour. They must have recognised my face. And halfway down the slope came a tumult in the air. Clang, clank, clang, clank. And we stopped. And presently over the hill crest those war things came flying, one behind the other. The man seemed hesitating on the verge of a description. What were they like? I asked. They had never fought, he said. They were just like our ironclads are nowadays. They had never fought. No one knew what they might do. They were great driving things shaped like spearheads without a shaft, with a propeller in the place of the shaft. And they carried guns? Little guns, firing high explosive shells. They fired the guns backwards, out of the base of the leaf, so to speak, and rammed with the beak. That was the theory, you know, but they had never been fought. No one could tell exactly what was going to happen. And meanwhile, I suppose it was very fine to go whirling through the air like a flight of young swallows, swift and easy. I guess the captains tried not to think too clearly what the real thing would be like. And these flying war machines, you know, were only one sort of the endless war contrivances that had been invented and had fallen into abeyance during the long peace. You know the silly way of these ingenious sort of men who make these things. They turn them out as beavers build dams, with no more sense of the rivers they're going to divert and the lands they're going to flood. As we went down the winding stepway to our hotel again, in the twilight, I foresaw it all. I saw how clearly and inevitably things were driving for war in Evesham's silly, violent hands. And I had some inkling of what war was bound to be under these new conditions. And even then, though I knew it was drawing near the limit of my opportunity, I could find no will to go back. He sighed. She counselled me to go back. "My dearest," she said, and her sweet face looked up to me, "this is death. This life you lead is death. Go back to them. Go back to your duty." She began to weep, saying between her sobs and clinging to my arm as she said it, "Go back. Go back." Then suddenly she fell mute, and glancing down at her face, I read in an instant the thing she had thought to do. It was one of those moments when one sees. "No," I said. "Nothing shall send me back. Nothing. I have chosen. Whatever happens, I will live this life. I will live for you, even if you died." "Yes," she murmured softly. "Then I also would die." And before she could speak again, I began to talking eloquently, as I could do in that life, talking to exalt love, to make the life we were living seem heroic and glorious, and the thing I was deserting something hard and enormously ignoble, that it was a fine thing to set aside. I bent all my mind to throw that glamour upon it, seeking not only to convert her, but myself to that. And so my moment passed. It was my last chance. The leaders of the South and East were gathering their resolve, and the hot answer that shattered Evesham's bluffing forever took shape and waited. The air and the wires were throbbing with warnings to prepare, prepare. No one living, you know, knew what war was. No one could imagine, with all these new inventions, what horror war might bring. I believe most people still believed it would be a matter of bright uniforms and shouting charges and triumphs and flags and bands, in a time when half the world drew its food supply from regions 10,000 miles away. The man with the white face paused. A little railway station, a signal box shot by the carriage window, and a bridge passed with a clap of noise, echoing the tumult of the train. "After that," he said, "I dreamt often. For 3 weeks of nights that dream was my life. And the worst of it was that there were nights when I could not dream, when I lay tossing on a bed in this accursed life. And there, somewhere lost to me, things were happening, momentous, terrible things. I lived at nights, my days, my waking days. This life I am living now became a faded, far-away dream. I could tell you all, every little thing in the dream, but as to what I did in the daytime, no, I could not tell. I do not remember. My memory has gone. The business of life slips from me. He pressed his hands upon his eyes. For a long time he said nothing. And then, said I, the war burst like a hurricane. He stared before him at unspeakable things. One touch of unreality, he said in the low tone of a man who speaks to himself, and they would have been nightmares. But they were not nightmares. No. He was silent for so long that it dawned upon me that there was a danger of losing the rest of the story. But he went on talking again, in the same tone of questioning self-communion. What was there to do but flight? I had not thought the war would touch Capri, but 2 nights after, the whole place was shouting and bawling. Every woman almost and every other man wore a badge, Evesham's badge, and there was no music but a jangling war song over and over again, and everywhere men enlisting. The whole island was awhirl with rumours. It was said again and again that fighting had begun. I had not expected this. I had seen so little of the life of pleasure that I had failed to reckon with this violence of the amateurs. The crowd jostled us and bawled in our ears. That accursed song deafened us. A woman shrieked at my lady because no badge was on her, and we too went back to our own place again. My lady white and silent, and I a-quiver with rage. So furious was I could have quarrelled with her if I could have found one shade of accusation in her eyes. I walked up and down our rock cell. "We must get out of this place," I said over and over. "I have made my choice, and I will have no hand in these troubles. I will have nothing of this war. This is no refuge for us. Let us go." And the next day we were already in flight from the war that covered the world. And all the rest was flight. All the rest was flight. He mused darkly. I tried to draw him back to his story with questions. "Where did you go?" I said. "When?" "When you left Capri." "Southwest," he said, and glanced at me for a second. "We went in a boat." "But I should have thought an aeroplane." "They had been seized." He broke out in an argumentative monotone. "But why should it be? If indeed this battle, this slaughter and stress is life, why have we this craving for pleasure and beauty? If there is no refuge, if there is no place of peace, and if all our dreams of quiet places are a folly and a snare, why have we such dreams? Love had come to me, more glorious than all else in life, and summoned me away. I had silenced all the voices, I had answered all the questions, and suddenly there was nothing but war and death. I had an inspiration. "After all," I said, "it could have been only a dream." "A dream?" he cried, flaming upon me. "A dream? When even now—" For the first time he became animated. A faint flush crept into his cheek. He spoke, looking away from me, and for all the rest of the time he looked away. "We are but phantoms," he said, "and the phantoms of phantoms, desires like cloud shadows and wills of straw that eddy in the wind. But one thing is real and certain. One thing is no dream stuff, but eternal and enduring. It is the centre of my life, and all other things about it are subordinate. I loved her, that woman of a dream, and she and I are dead together." A dream? How can it be a dream when it drenched a living life with unappeasable sorrow, when it makes all that I have lived for and cared for worthless and unmeaning? Until that very moment when she was killed, I believe we still had a chance of getting away, he said. All through the night and morning that we sailed across the sea from Capri to Salerno, we talked of escape. We were full of hope, and it clung about us to the end. Hope for the life together we should lead, out of it all, out of the battle and struggle, the wild and empty passions. We were uplifted as though our quest was a holy thing, as though love for another was a mission. Even when from our boat we saw the fair face of that great rock Capri, already scarred and gashed by the gun emplacements, we reckoned nothing of the imminent slaughter. "It is love and reason," I said, "fleeing from all this madness of war." And though we presently saw a squadron of aeroplanes flying across the southern sky, we did not heed it. There it was, a line of little dots in the sky, and then more, dotting the southeastern horizon, and then still more, until all that quarter of the sky was stippled with blue specks. They came, rising and falling and growing larger, like some huge flight of gulls, moving with a marvellous uniformity as they spread over a greater width of sky. Suddenly they swept round to the eastward and streamed eastward, growing smaller and smaller and clearer again until they vanished from the sky. And after that we noted to the northward and very high Evesham's fighting machines hanging high over Naples like an evening swarm of gnats. It seemed to have no more to do with us than a flight of birds. Even the mutter of guns far away in the southeast seemed to us to signify nothing. Each day, each dream after that, we were still exalted, still seeking that refuge where we might live and love. Fatigue had come upon us, pain and many distresses. For though we were dusty and stained by our toilsome tramping, and half-starved and with the horror of the dead men we had seen and the flight of the peasants, for very soon a gust of fighting swept up the peninsula, with these things haunting our minds, it still resulted only in a deepening resolution to escape. Oh, but she was brave and patient. She who had never faced hardship and exposure had courage for herself and me. We went to and fro, seeking an outlet, over a country all commandeered and ransacked by the gathering hosts of war. Always we went on foot. We had landed at Salerno, and we had been turned back from Cava, and we had tried to cross towards Taranto by a pass over Mount Alberno, but we had been driven back for want of food, so we had come down among the marshes by Paestum, where the great temples stand alone. I had some vague idea that by Paestum it might be possible to find a boat or something, and take once more to sea. And there it was the battle overtook us. A sort of soul-blindness had me. Plainly I could see that we were being hemmed in, that the great net of that giant warfare had us in its toils. But all these things do not matter now, these nights of flight and pain. We were in an open place near those great temples at Paestum, at last, on a blank stony place dotted with spiky bushes, empty and desolate, and so flat that a grove of eucalyptus far away showed to the feet of its stems. How I can see it! My lady was sitting down under a bush resting a little, for she was very weak and weary, and I was standing up, watching to see if I could tell the distance of the firing that came and went. They were still, fighting far from each other, with those terrible new weapons that had never before been used, guns that would carry beyond sight, and aeroplanes that would do what they would do no man could foretell. I knew that we were between the two armies, and that they drew together. I knew we were in danger, and that we could not stop there and rest. Though all these things were in my mind, they were in the background. Chiefly I was thinking of my lady. An aching distress filled me. For the first time she had owned herself beaten. Behind me I could hear her sobbing, but I would not turn round to her because I knew she had need of weeping, and had held herself so far and so long for me. It was well, I thought, that she would weep and rest, and then we would toil on again. Even now I can see her as she sat there, her lovely hair upon her shoulder, can mark again the deepening hollow of her cheek. And then, overhead in the sky flashed something and burst, and all about us I heard the bullets making a noise like a handful of peas suddenly thrown. They chipped the stones about us, and whirled fragments from the bricks, and passed. He put his hand to his mouth, and then moistened his lips. At the flash I had turned about. You know, she stood up. She stood up and moved a step towards me, as though she wanted to reach me, and she had been shot through the heart. He stopped and stared at me. I felt all that foolish incapacity an Englishman feels on such occasions. I met his eyes for a moment, and then stared out of the window. For a long space we kept silence. When at last I looked at him, he was sitting back in his corner, his arms folded, and his teeth gnawing at his knuckles. "I carried her," he said, "towards the temples in my arms. I don't know why. They seemed a sort of sanctuary, you know. She must have died almost instantly. Only I talked to her all the way." Silence again. "I have seen those temples," I said abruptly, and indeed he had brought those still, sunlit arcades of worn sandstone very vividly before me. "It was the brown one, the big brown one. I sat down on a fallen pillar and held her in my arms. And after a little while the lizards came out and ran about again, as though nothing unusual was going on, as though nothing had changed. 3 or 4 times shells burst about the beach, and then that ceased. Each time that happened, all the lizards scuttled in and hid for a space. That was all the mischief done, except that once a stray bullet gashed the stone hard by, made just a fresh, bright surface. "The curious thing," he remarked with the manner of a man who makes a trivial conversation, "is that I didn't think at all. I sat with her in my arms amidst the stones, in a sort of lethargy, stagnant. And I don't remember waking up. I don't remember dressing that day. I know I found myself in my office, with my letters all slit open in front of me, and how I was struck by the absurdity of being there, seeing that in reality I was sitting stunned in that Pestum temple with a dead woman in my arms." He stopped, and there was a long silence. Suddenly I perceived that we were running down the incline from Chalk Farm to Euston. I started at this passing of time. I turned on him with a brutal question, with the tone of now or never. "And did you dream again?" "Yes." He seemed to force himself to finish. His voice was very low. "Once more. I seemed to have suddenly awakened out of a great apathy, to have risen into a sitting position, and the body lay there on the stones beside me. A gaunt body. Not her, you know. So soon. It was not her. I may have heard voices, I do not know. Only I knew clearly that men were coming into the solitude, and that was a last outrage. I stood up and walked through the temple, and then there came into sight first one man dressed in a uniform of dirty white trimmed with blue, and then several climbing to the crest of the old wall of the vanished city and crouching there. They were little bright figures in the sunlight, and there they hung, weapon in hand, peering cautiously before them. And further away I saw others, and then more at another point in the wall. Presently the man I had first seen stood up and shouted a command, and his men came tumbling down the wall and into the high weeds towards the temple. He came facing towards me, and when he saw me, he stopped. At first I had watched these men with a mere curiosity, but when I had seen they meant to come to the temple, I was moved to forbid them. I shouted to the officer. "You must not come here," I cried. "I am here. I am here with my dead." He stared, and then shouted a question back to me in some unknown tongue. I repeated what I had said. He shouted again, and I folded my arms and stood still. Presently he spoke to his men and came forward. He carried a drawn sword. I signed to him to keep away, but he continued to advance. Presently he was so close I could see his face clearly. It was a narrow face, with dull grey eyes and a black moustache. He had a scar on his upper lip, and he was dirty and unshaven. He kept shouting unintelligible things, questions perhaps, at me. I know now that he was afraid of me, but at the time that did not occur to me. As I tried to explain to him, he interrupted me in imperious tones, bidding me, I suppose, stand aside. He made to go past me, and I caught hold of him. I saw his face change at my grip. "You fool," I cried. "Don't you know? She's dead." He started back. He looked at me with cruel eyes. I saw a sort of exultant resolve leap into them, delight. Then, suddenly, with a scowl, he swept his sword back. So, and thrust. He stopped abruptly. I became aware of a change in the rhythm of the train. The brakes lifted their voices, and the carriage jarred and jerked. This present world insisted upon itself, became clamorous. I saw through the steamy window a signal box hoisting its constellation of green and red into the murky London twilight. I looked again at his drawn features. He ran me through the heart. It was a sort of astonishment, no fear, no pain, but just amazement. I felt it pierce me, felt the sword drive home into my body. The yellow platform lights came into the field of view, passing first rapidly, then slowly, and at last stopping with a jerk. Dim shapes of men passed to and fro without. "Euston!" cried a voice. "Do you mean—" There was no pain, no sting or smart. Amazement, and then darkness sweeping over everything. The hot, brutal face before me, the face of the man who had killed me, seemed to recede. It swept out of existence. "Euston!" clamoured the voices outside. "Euston!" The carriage door opened, admitting a flood of sound, and a porter stood regarding us. The sounds of doors slamming, and the hoof-clatter of cab-horses, and behind these things the featureless remote roar of the London cobblestones, came to my ears. A darkness, a flood of darkness that opened and spread and blotted out all things. "Any luggage, sir?" said the porter. "And that was the end?" I asked. He seemed to hesitate. Then, almost inaudibly, he answered, "No." "You mean—" "I couldn't get to her. She was there on the other side of the temple. And then—" "Yes," I insisted. "Yes." "Nightmares," he cried. "Nightmares indeed. My God, great birds that fought and tore."
A Dream of Armageddon was read by Robert Bathurst. The producer was Gemma Jenkins.
Welcome to GoldenAgeRadio.com, rumble.com/C/GAR. Brand new episodes every week. Visit VeteransRadioMinistry.com to listen to more episodes like this.
The New Accelerator by H.G. Wells. Certainly, if ever a man found a guinea when he was looking for a pin, it is my good friend Professor Gibbon. He has really, without any touch of exaggeration in the phrase, found something to revolutionize human life. And that when he was simply seeking an all-round nervous stimulant to bring languid people up to the stresses of these pushful days. I have tasted the stuff now several times, and I cannot do better than describe the effect the thing had on me. Professor Gibbon, as many people know, is my neighbour in Folkestone. He occupies one of those pleasant little detached houses in the mixed style that makes the western end of the Upper Sandgate Road so interesting. He likes to talk to me about his work. He is one of those men who find a help and stimulus in talking, and so I've been able to follow the conception of the new Accelerator right up from a very early stage. As everyone knows, or at least as all intelligent people know, the special department in which Gibbon has gained so great and deserved a reputation among physiologists is the action of drugs upon the nervous system. In the last few years he has been particularly assiduous upon this question of nervous stimulants, and already, before the discovery of the new Accelerator, very successful with them. In cases of exhaustion, the preparation known as Gibbon's bee syrup has, I suppose, saved more lives already than any lifeboat round the coast.
"But none of these little things begin to satisfy me yet," he told me nearly a year ago. "Either they increase the central energy without affecting the nerves, or they simply increase the available energy by lowering the nervous conductivity. And all of them are unequal and local in their operation. One wakes up the heart and viscera and leaves the brain stupefied. One gets at the brain champagne fashion and does nothing good for the solar plexus. And what I want, and what, if it's an earthly possibility, I mean to have, is a stimulant that stimulates all round, that wakes you up for a time from the crown of your head to the tip of your great toe, and makes you go 2 or even 3 to everybody else's 1. That's the thing I'm after."
"It would tire a man," I said.
"Not a doubt of it. And you'd eat double or treble and all that. But just think what the thing would mean. The power to think twice as fast, move twice as quickly, do twice as much work in a given time as you could otherwise do."
"But is such a thing possible?"
"I believe so. If it isn't, I've wasted my time for a year. These various preparations of the hypophosphites, for example, seem to show that something of the sort, even if it was only 1.5 times as fast, it would do. If you were a statesman in the corner, for example, time rushing up against you, something urgent to be done, eh?"
"He could dose his private secretary," I said.
"And gain double time. And think if you, for example, wanted to finish a book."
"Usually," I said. "I wish I'd never begun 'em."
"You see," said Gibbon, "if I get it as an all-round thing, it will really do you no harm at all, except perhaps to an infinitesimal degree it brings you nearer old age."
"And you really think such a thing is possible?" I said.
"As possible," said Gibbon, and glanced at something that went throbbing by the window, "as a motor bus. As a matter of fact—"
He paused and smiled at me deeply.
"I think I know the stuff. Already I've got something coming."
The nervous smile upon his face betrayed the gravity of his revelation. He rarely talked of his actual experimental work unless things were very near the end.
"And it may be, I shouldn't be surprised, it may even do the thing at a greater rate than twice."
"It will be rather a big thing," I hazarded.
"It will be, I think, rather a big thing."
But I don't think he quite knew what a big thing it was to be, for all that. I remember we had several talks about the stuff after that. The new Accelerator, he called it, and his tone about it grew more confident on each occasion. We debated long and anxiously how the preparation might be turned to commercial account.
"It's a good thing," said Gibbon. "I know I'm giving the world something, and I think it only reasonable we should expect the world to pay. The dignity of science is all very well, but I think somehow I must have the monopoly of the stuff for, say, 10 years. I don't see why all the fun in life should go to the dealers in ham."
My own interest in the coming drug certainly did not wane in the time. I have always had a queer little twist towards metaphysics in my mind. I have always been given to paradoxes about space and time, and it seemed to me that Gibbon was really preparing no less than the absolute acceleration of life. Suppose a man repeatedly dosed with such preparation. He would live an active and record life indeed, but he would be adult at 11, middle-aged at 25, and by 30 well on the road to senile decay. The marvel of drugs has always been great to my mind. You can madden a man, calm a man, make him incredibly strong and alert, or a helpless log. Quicken this passion and allay that, all by means of drugs. And here was a new miracle to be added to this strange armoury of phials the doctors use. It was the 7th or 8th of August when he told me the distillation that would decide his failure or success for a time was going forward as we talked. And it was on the 10th that he told me the thing was done, and the new accelerator a tangible reality in the world. I met him as I was going up the Sandgate Hill towards Folkestone. I think I was going to get my hair cut, and he came hurrying down to meet me. I remember that his eyes were unusually bright, and his face flushed, and I noted even then the swift alacrity of his step.
"It's done," he cried, speaking very fast. "Come up to my house and see."
"Really? And it does twice?"
"It does much more, much more. Oh, it scares me. Come up and see the stuff."
He gripped my arm, and walking at such a pace that he forced me into a trot, went shouting with me up the hill. It was one of those hot, clear days that Folkestone sees so much of, every colour incredibly bright and every outline hard. There was a breeze, of course, but not so much breeze as sufficed under these conditions to keep me cool and dry. "You've been taking some of this stuff," I puffed.
"No," he said. "At the utmost, a drop of water that stood in a beaker from which I had washed out the last traces of the stuff. I took some last night, you know, but that is ancient history now."
"And it goes twice?" I said, nearing his doorway in a grateful perspiration.
"It goes 1,000 times. Many 1,000 times," cried Gibbon, flinging open his gate.
"Phew," I said, and followed him to the door.
"I don't know how many times it goes," he said, with his latchkey in his hand. "It throws all sorts of light on nervous physiology. It kicks the theory of vision into a perfectly new shape. Oh, we'll try all that after. The thing is, to try the stuff now."
"Try the stuff?" I said, as we went along the passage.
"Rather," said Gibbon, turning on me in his study. "There it is, in that little green phial. Unless you happen to be afraid."
I'm a careful man by nature, and only theoretically adventurous. I was afraid. But on the other hand, there is pride. "Well," I haggled, "you say you've tried it?"
"I've tried it," he said, "and I don't look hurt by it, do I?"
I sat down. "Give me the potion," I said. "If the worst comes to the worst, it will save having my hair cut, and I think that is one of the most hateful duties of a civilized man. How do you take the mixture?"
"With water,"
said Gibbon, whacking down a carafe. He stood up in front of his desk and regarded me in his easy chair. His manner was suddenly affected by a touch of the Harley Street specialist.
"I must warn you, in the first place, as soon as you've got it down, to shut your eyes and open them very cautiously in a minute or so's time. One still sees. The sense of vision is a question of length of vibration and not of multitude of impacts, but there is a kind of shock to the retina, a nasty, giddy confusion just at the time if the eyes are open. Keep 'em shut."
"Shut," I said. "Good."
"And the next thing is, keep still. Don't begin to whack about. You may fetch something a nasty rap if you do. Remember, you will be going several 1,000 times faster than you ever did before. You'll feel just as you do now, only everything in the world will seem to be going ever so many 1,000 times slower than it ever went before."
"Lord," I said, "and you mean—"
"You'll see,"
he said, and he took up a little measure. The little phial glucked out its precious contents.
"Don't forget what I told you,"
he said, turning the contents of the measure into a glass in the manner of an Italian waiter measuring whisky.
"Sit with the eyes tightly shut and in absolute stillness for 2 minutes. Then you will hear me speak."
He added an inch or so of water to the dose in each glass. He raised his glass. "The new Accelerator," I said. "The new Accelerator," he answered, and we touched glasses and drank. You know that blank non-existence into which one drops when one has taken gas? For an indefinite interval, it was like that. Then I heard Gibbon telling me to wake up, and I stirred and opened my eyes. There he stood, as he had been standing, glass still in hand. It was empty. That was all the difference. "Well," said I. "Nothing out of the way?" "Nothing. A slight feeling of exhilaration, perhaps. Nothing more." "Sounds?" "Things are still," I said. "By Jove, yes, they are still, except that sort of faint pat-patter like rain falling. What is it?" "Analysed sounds," I think he said, but I'm not sure. He glanced at the window. "Have you ever seen a curtain before a window fixed in that way before?" I followed his eyes, and there was the end of the curtain, frozen, as it were, corner high, in the act of flapping briskly in the breeze. "No," I said. "That's odd." "And here," he said, and opened the hand that held the glass. Naturally, I winced, expecting the glass to smash. But so far from smashing, it did not even seem to stir. It hung in mid-air, motionless. "Roughly speaking," said Gibbon, "an object in these latitudes falls 16 feet in the first second. This glass is falling 16 feet in a second now. Only, you see, it hasn't been falling yet for the 100th part of a second. That gives you some idea of the pace of my accelerator." And he waved his hand round and round, over and under the slowly sinking glass. Finally, he took it by the bottom, pulled it down, and placed it very carefully on the table. I began very gingerly to raise myself from my chair. I was going fast all over. My heart, for example, was beating 1,000 times a second, but that caused me no discomfort at all. I looked out of the window. An immovable cyclist, head down, and with a frozen puff of dust behind his driving wheel, scorched to overtake a galloping char-a-banc that did not stir. I gaped in amazement. "Gibbon!" I cried. "How long will this confounded stuff last?" "Heaven knows," he answered. "Last time I took it, I went to bed and slept it off. It must have lasted some minutes, I think. Seemed like hours. But after a bit it slows down rather suddenly, I believe." I was proud to observe that I did not feel frightened. I suppose because there were two of us. "Why shouldn't we go out?" I asked. "Why not?" "They'll see us." "Not they. Goodness, no. Why, we shall be going 1,000 times faster than the quickest conjuring trick that was ever done. Come along." Assuredly, of all the strange experiences that I've ever had, or imagined, or read of other people having or imagining, that little raid I made with Gibbon on the Folkestone Leas under the influence of the new Accelerator was the strangest and maddest of all. We went out by his gate into the road, and there we made a minute examination of the statuesque passing traffic. The tops of the wheels and some of the legs of the horses of this char-a-banc, the end of the whiplash and the lower jaw of the conductor, who was just beginning to yawn, were perceptibly in motion, but all the rest of the lumbering conveyance seemed still, and quite noiseless except for a faint rattling that came from one man's throat. The effect, as we walked about, began by being madly queer, and ended by being disagreeable. There they were, people like ourselves, and yet not like ourselves, frozen in careless attitudes, caught in mid-gesture. A girl and a man smiled at one another, a leering smile that threatened to last for evermore. A woman in a floppy capelline rested her arm on the rail and stared at Gibbon's house with the unwinking stare of eternity. A man stroked his moustache like a figure of wax. We stared at them, we laughed at them, we made faces at them, and then a sort of disgust of them came upon us, and we turned away and walked round in front of the cyclist towards the leas. "Goodness!" cried Gibbon suddenly. "Look there!" He pointed, and there at the tip of his finger, and sliding down the air with wings flapping slowly and at the speed of an exceptionally languid snail, was a bee. And so we came out upon the leas. There the thing seemed madder than ever. The band was playing in the upper stand, though all the sound it made for us was a low-pitched, wheezy rattle, a sort of prolonged last sigh that passed at times into a sound like the slow, muffled ticking of some monstrous clock. "Lord, look here!" cried Gibbon, and we halted for a moment before a magnificent person in white faint-striped flannels, white shoes, and a Panama hat, who turned back to wink at two gaily dressed ladies he'd passed. A wink, studied with such leisurely deliberation as we could afford, is an unattractive thing. It loses any quality of alert gaiety, and one remarks that the winking eye does not completely close, that under its drooping lid appears the lower edge of an eyeball and a little line of white. "Heaven give me memory," said I, "and I will never wink again." "Or smile," said Gibbon, with his eye on the lady's answering teeth. "It's infernally hot, somehow," said I. "Let's go slower." "Oh, come along," said Gibbon. We walked a little way from the crowd and turned and regarded it. To see all that multitude changed to a picture, smitten rigid, as it were, into the semblance of realistic wax, was impossibly wonderful. It was absurd, of course, but it filled me with an irrational, an exultant sense of superior advantage. Consider the wonder of it. All that I had said and thought and done since the stuff had begun to work in my veins had happened, so far as those people, so far as the world in general went, in the twinkling of an eye. "The new Accelerator," I began, but Gibbon interrupted me. "There's that infernal old woman," he said. "What old woman?" "Lives next door to me," said Gibbon. "Has a lapdog that yaps. Gosh, the temptation is strong." There is something very boyish and impulsive about Gibbon at times. Before I could expostulate with him, he had dashed forward, snatched the unfortunate animal out of visible existence, and was running violently with it towards the cliff of the leas. It was most extraordinary. The little brute, you know, didn't bark or wriggle or make the slightest sign of vitality. It kept quite stiffly in an attitude of somnolent repose, and Gibbon held it by the neck. It was like running about with a dog of wood. "Gibbon," I cried, "put it down!" Then I said something else. "If you run like that," I cried, "you'll set your clothes on fire." He clapped his hand on his thigh and stood hesitating on the verge. "Gibbon," I cried, coming up, "put it down. This heat is too much. 2 or 3 miles a second. Friction of the air." "What?" he said, glancing at the dog. "Friction of the air," I shouted. "Going too fast, like meteorites and things. Too hot. And Gibbon, I'm all over pricking and a sort of perspiration. You can see people stirring slightly. I believe the stuff's working off. Put that dog down." "Eh?" he said. "It's working off," I repeated. "We're too hot and the stuff's working off." He stared at me, then at the band, the wheezy rattle of whose performance was certainly going faster. Then, with a tremendous sweep of the arm, he hurled the dog away from him, and it went spinning upward, still inanimate, and hung at last over the grouped parasols of a knot of chattering people. Gibbon was gripping my elbow. "By Jove," he cried, "I believe it is. A sort of hot pricking, and, yes, that man's moving his pocket handkerchief, perceptibly. We must get out of this, sharp." But we could not get out of it sharply enough. Luckily, perhaps, for we might have run, and if we had run, we should, I believe, have burst into flames. You know, we had neither of us thought of that. But before we could even begin to run, the action of the drug had ceased. It was the business of a minute fraction of a second. The effect of the new accelerator passed like the drawing of a curtain, vanished in the movement of a hand. I heard Gibbon's voice in infinite alarm. "Sit down," he said, and flop, down upon the turf at the edge of the leas I sat, scorching as I sat. There is a patch of burnt grass there still where I sat down. The whole stagnation seemed to wake up as I did so. The disarticulated vibration of the band rushed together into a blast of music. The promenaders put their feet down and walked their ways. The papers and flags began flapping. Smiles passed into words. The winker finished his wink and went on his way complacently. The little dog, which had seemed to hang for a moment when the force of Gibbon's arm was expended, fell with a swift acceleration clean through a lady's parasol. That was the saving of us. I doubt if a solitary person remarked our sudden appearance among them. The attention of everyone, including even the Amusements Association band, which, on this occasion, for the only time in its history, got out of tune, was arrested by the amazing fact that a respectable, overfed lapdog, sleeping quietly to the east of the bandstand, should suddenly fall through the parasol of a lady on the west. People got up and trod on other people. Chairs were overturned. The Lees policeman ran. How the matter settled itself, I do not know. We were much too anxious to disentangle ourselves from the affair. As soon as we were sufficiently cool and sufficiently recovered from our giddiness and nausea and confusion of mind to do so, we stood up and, skirting the crowd, directed our steps back along the road below the Metropole towards Gibbon's house. The sudden return of movement and familiar noises, and our natural anxiety about ourselves — our clothes were still dreadfully hot, and the front of the thighs of Gibbon's white trousers were scorched a drabbish brown — prevented the minute observations I should have liked to make on all these things. Indeed, I really made no observations of any scientific value on that return. The bee, of course, had gone. I looked for that cyclist, but he was already out of sight as we came into the Upper Sandgate Road, or hidden from us by traffic. The char-a-banc, however, with its people now all alive and stirring, was clattering along at a spanking pace almost abreast of the nearer church. So it was I had my first experience of the new Accelerator. Practically, we had been running about and saying and doing all sorts of things in the space of a second or so of time. Considering all things, and particularly considering our rashness in venturing out of the house, the experience might certainly have been much more disagreeable than it was. It showed, no doubt, that Gibbon still has much to learn before his preparation is a manageable convenience, but its practicability is certainly demonstrated beyond all cavil. Since that adventure he has been steadily bringing its use under control, and I have several times, and without the slightest bad result, taken measured doses under his direction. I may mention, for example, that this story has been written at one sitting, and without interruption, except for the nibbling of some chocolate, by its means. I began at 6:25, and my watch is now very nearly at the minute past the half-hour. The convenience of securing a long, uninterrupted spell of work in the midst of a day full of engagements cannot be exaggerated. Gibbon is now working at the quantitative handling of his preparation, with a special reference to its distinctive effects upon different types of constitution. He then hopes to find a retarder with which to dilute its present rather excessive potency. The retarder will, of course, have the reverse effect of the accelerator. Used alone, it should enable the patient to spread a few seconds over many hours of ordinary time, and so to maintain a glacier-like absence of alacrity amidst the most animated or irritating surroundings. The two things together must necessarily work an entire revolution in civilized existence. It is the beginning of our escape from that time garment of which Carlyle speaks. The Accelerator's appearance upon the market in a convenient, controllable, and assimilable form is a matter of the next few months. It will be obtainable of all chemists and druggists in small green bottles at a high, but, considering its extraordinary qualities, by no means excessive price. Gibbon's Nervous Accelerator it will be called, and he hopes to be able to supply it in 3 strengths, 1 in 200, 1 in 900, and 1 in 2000. No doubt its use renders a great number of very extraordinary things possible. For, of course, the most remarkable, and Possibly even criminal proceedings may be effected with impunity by thus dodging, as it were, into the interstices of time. Like all potent preparations, it will be liable to abuse. We have, however, discussed this aspect of the question very thoroughly, and we have decided that it is purely a matter of medical jurisprudence, and altogether outside our province. We shall manufacture and sell the Accelerator, and, as for the consequences, we shall see.
The New Accelerator by H.G. Wells was read by Robert Bathurst. The producer was Gemma Jenkins.
Welcome to GoldenAgeRadio.com, rumble.com/C/GAR. Brand new episodes every week. Visit VeteransRadioMinistry.com to listen to more episodes like this.
Excuse me. I say, excuse me.
Yes, sir.
Have you seen Mr. Clayton anywhere?
Mr. Clayton, sir. He was here a minute ago. Oh, there he is, sir. The window seat in the corner.
Oh, yes. Sorry, didn't see him. Thank you.
And so, there I was, standing with my golf club ready. Ah, Sanderson. There you are, at last.
Hello, Clayton.
Hello, old boy.
Hello, Evans. Wish.
Hello, Sanderson.
I'm terribly sorry being so late.
Thought you weren't coming.
No, I really am truly sorry. Had trouble with the car.
Not an accident, I hope.
No, nothing like that. Just a mechanical fault.
Serious?
Nothing I couldn't sort out myself, fortunately, but it held me up for over an hour.
How I admire people with practical minds. See?
Well, you look none the worse for wear, anyway.
Well, I'd been up to my room to clean up and change.
Where have you put your clubs, then?
Left them in the car. Thought I'd pick them up as we go out. I didn't know whether you might be out on the course already.
What, start without you, Sanderson? What kind of chaps do you think we are? Your late arrival gave us an excuse for another drink.
Clayton is determined to win today, Sanderson, even if he has to resort to getting the competitors totally drunk.
Oh, what a thing to say, old boy. Most unsportsmanlike. Jerry!
Coming, sir.
Same again, please. What do you want, Sanderson?
Look, as I was late, let me get them, will you?
Nonsense.
No, please, I'd like to.
Won't hear of it, old boy. What do you want?
Well, pink gin, if you don't mind.
And a pink gin, Jerry. Large one?
No, look, steady on.
What's the matter, Sanderson? With one of those inside you, you'd be able to hole in one. Mark my words.
Who was the last club member to hole in one?
Don't tell me you've forgotten, Wish. Weatherby.
Stanley Weatherby. That's right.
Hole in one didn't buy a soul a drink. Not even his partner. Hole in one didn't even set foot in the bar.
Oh, I remember now.
Clearly no gentleman.
I was here the day it happened. I saw it with my own eyes. News spread like wildfire. He came back, looked at his watch, mumbled something about being in a hurry, acknowledged members who were applauding him, got into his rolls, drove off.
Man was a cad.
Owned half of Yorkshire.
Half of Yorkshire, Clayton.
All right, Sanderson, a third. Well, certainly several villages around the Milleries. Of course, he didn't remain a member for long.
Should hope not.
It was put to him, tactfully, of course, that it simply wasn't done. Not in golfing circles or any other circles frequented by a gentleman. Why? As he wasn't considered a gentleman, he was told to leave forthwith. I was on the management committee at the time. He cried.
Oh, come on, Clayton.
I tell you, he cried, Sanderson. Well, very nearly. Eyes were moist.
Here we are, gentlemen.
Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you, sir.
On my tab.
No, it's my turn, really.
Actually, I
thought
think
I
it's
was
my
going to buy
round.
this round.
For heaven's sake, will you stop arguing like a lot of old women? This is my treat. Thank you, Jerry.
Sir?
Cheers, then.
Cheers.
Cheers, Clayton.
Cheers, old man.
Thank you.
Now, listen to me. I feel lucky today. I'll put a fiver in the kitty for anyone who gets 3 under par. Now, how about it?
3 under par.
Oh, come on, Wish, old man. You can play jolly well when you put your mind to it.
Well...
And money has a way of concentrating the mind.
I'm game.
Thought you might be, Evans. What about you, Sanderson?
All right.
Right. We'll down this lot and then tee off, eh?
Right.
I've ordered roast duck for dinner tonight. How's that?
Marvellous.
I think we should
have
make
done that, really,
some
Clayton.
contribution here.
Oh, no. Look, I tell you, my friends, I feel lucky. I'll be taking that £15 off you later on when I win our little bet. So you'll be paying for dinner anyway. Huh? You will.
Well, Clayton, you were true to your word. We ended up paying for the meal.
Oh, yes. Well, I knew you would. You just feel lucky, that's all. More brandy, anyone?
Not for me, thank you.
No, thank you.
Just a little, please, Clayton, yes.
We can finish this decanter together, eh, you wish, old chap?
Oh, I don't know about that. I can't move as it is.
You don't have to move to enjoy brandy, old boy. Just lie there, soak it up. Like a Christmas pudding. There.
Thank you.
Poke the fire, someone. Getting low.
I'll do it.
Thank you, wish, old boy. Yeah, that's better. You know, I stayed here last night.
No?
Neither did I.
I was absolutely alone in the place.
Oh, not absolutely alone, surely. What about the domestics?
Oh, well, of course the domestics were here, wish, but they sleep in the other wing. Well,
Yes.
You were going to say?
no, nothing.
Yes, you were, Clayton. Something happened last night.
Well, I caught a ghost, actually.
Caught a ghost, did you?
Yes.
And where is it?
Caught a ghost. You must tell us about it.
You don't seem in the least bit surprised, Evans. I suppose your 4 weeks in the great spaces of America have made you impervious to such pronouncements.
Not at all, old boy. I'm interested to see whether your story matches the size of some of those the Americans have a habit of telling at the drop of a hat.
Yeah, or an oil well, eh?
I see. Wish, old chap.
Yes, Clayton?
Close the door, will you?
Huh?
I know no one deliberately eavesdrops in the club, but I wouldn't want to upset our very excellent service with any rumours of ghosts.
Come on,
And
Clayton.
this ghost, well, it wasn't a normal ghost. Don't think it'll come back again, ever.
Are you serious?
Close the door, Wish. There's a good fellow.
Right.
You mean to say you didn't keep it?
Are you actually taking him seriously, Sanderson?
The truth is, I hadn't the heart to.
You hadn't the heart to do what?
Keep it.
You are serious?
Yes.
A ghost?
Yes.
Come on, Clayton. You've drunk too much brandy.
The fact is, it really was a ghost. I'm sure of it. As sure as I'm talking to you now. I'm not joking. I mean what I say.
Well,
I think I will have a little more brandy, if you don't mind, please, Wish.
Oh, yes, of course, Evans.
It's the strangest thing that's ever happened to me in my life. You know, I never believed in ghosts or anything of the sort before, ever. And then I bag one in the corner.
You talked to it?
Yes, for the space of an hour or more, I suppose.
chatty.
Poor devil was in trouble.
Sobbing, was he?
If you must know, yes, poor fellow. I never realized the poor sort of thing a ghost might be. I took an advantage.
Look, Clayton, I don't understand. You're having us on, aren't you?
No, don't you understand? Yet? Look, a person remains just the same person even though he's disembodied. That's the thing we too often forget. People with a certain strength and fixity of purpose, most haunting ghosts, you know, must be as single-minded as monomaniacs and as opposite as mules to come back again and again. This poor creature wasn't like that.
Good God.
I say it in all kindness, but that is the plain truth of the case. Even at the first glance, he struck me as being weak.
Well, I don't know.
You don't know what, Evans?
I don't know what to say.
Well, don't say anything, my friend. Just listen. I came upon him in the long passage. His back was towards me, and I saw him first. Right off, I knew him for a ghost. He was transparent and whitish. Clean through his chest I could see the glimmer of the little window at the end. And not only his physique, but his attitude struck me as being weak. He looked as though he didn't know what to do.
Well, what sort of physique?
Lean. That sort of young man's neck that has two great flutings down the back here and here. And a little meanish head, with scrubby hair and rather bad ears. Shoulders bad, narrower than the hips. Turned-down collar, ready-made short jacket, trousers baggy and a little frayed at the heels. I came very quietly up the staircase, and I saw him. I stopped dead at that, taking him in. I wasn't a bit afraid. I think that in most of these affairs one is never nearly so afraid or excited as one imagines one might be. I was surprised and interested. I thought, good Lord, here's a ghost at last. And I hadn't believed for a moment in ghosts during my whole life. I suppose I wasn't on the landing a moment before he found out I was there. He turned on me sharply, and I saw the face of an immature young man. A weak nose, scrubby little moustache, and a feeble chin. So, for an instant, we stood. He looking over his shoulder at me, and we regarded one another. Then he seemed to remember his high calling. He turned round, drew himself up, projected his face, raised his arms, spread his hands in approved ghost fashion, and came towards me. As he did so, his little jaw dropped, and he emitted a faint, drawn-out boo. It wasn't a bit dreadful. Boo, I said. You don't belong to this place. What are you doing here? Are you a member? I said. And just to show him I didn't care a pin for him, I stepped through a corner of him and made to light my candle. What are you doing here? I said. He dropped his hands and stopped his booing, and there he stood, abashed and awkward, the ghost of a weak, silly, aimless young man. I'm haunting, he said. You haven't any business to, I said. I'm a ghost, he said. Well, that may be, but you haven't any business to haunt here. This is a respectable private club. If I were you, I wouldn't wait for cockcrow. I'd vanish right away. Well, he looked embarrassed. The fact is, sir, I can't, he said. You can't, I said. No, sir, there's something I've forgotten. I've been hanging about here since midnight last night, hiding in the cupboards of empty bedrooms and things like that. I'm flurried. I've never come haunting before, and it seems to put me out.
Come on, Clayton, you can't be serious.
Leave him, Evans. Let him continue.
Yes, let's hear the end of it, at least.
Put you out, I said.
Yes, sir. I've tried to do it several times, and it doesn't come off. Some little thing has slipped me, and I can't get back.
Well, that rather bowled me over. He looked at me in such an abject way that for the life of me I couldn't keep up quite the high hectoring vein that I'd adopted. Oh, that's queer, then, I said. And as I spoke, I fancied I heard someone moving about down below. Come into my room and tell me about it, I said. So we did. Sit on the armchair and tell me, old chap, how you got yourself into this awkward position, I said.
Are you telling us that you sat together in your bedroom upstairs?
No. He said he wouldn't sit down. He'd prefer to flit up and down the room if it was all right by me. And so he did. In a little while we were deep in a long and serious talk. He hadn't a particularly honest face. But being transparent, of course, he couldn't avoid telling the truth.
Eh? I don't...
What's that? What's that wish?
Being transparent. Couldn't avoid telling the truth. I don't see it.
I don't see it. But it is so, I can assure you. I don't believe he got once a nail's breadth off the Bible truth. He told me how he'd been killed. He went down into a London basement with a candle to look for a leakage of gas. Poor wretch. That's what I thought. And the more he talked, the more I thought it. There he was, purposeless in life and purposeless out of it. He talked of his father and his mother and his schoolmaster and all who had ever been anything to do with him in the world. He'd been too sensitive, too nervous. None of them had ever valued him properly or understood him, he said. He'd never had a real friend in the world, I think. Never had a success. Shirked games and failed examinations. And where are you now? I asked.
And what did he say to that?
Well, he wasn't clear on the point at all. The impression he gave me was of a sort of vague, intermediate state, a special reserve for souls too non-existent for anything so positive as either sin or virtue. I don't know. He was much too egotistical and unobservant to give me any clear idea of the kind of place, the kind of country there is on the other side of things. Wherever he was, he seemed to have fallen in with a set of kindred spirits, ghosts of weak, cockney young men, who were on a footing of Christian names, and among these there was certainly a lot of talk about going haunting. Yeah, things like that. Yeah, going haunting. They seemed to think haunting a tremendous adventure. Most of them funked it all the time.
And did you think this haunting of theirs to be a tremendous adventure for you, Clayton?
You still don't believe it, do you?
Go on, Clayton.
You see, Sanderson, it appeals to the actor.
Ah, yes, but Wish here is a professional actor. You're not. Now, at the moment, I can see clear through you.
Anyway, these are the impressions he gave me. Oh, I may, of course, have been in a rather uncritical state, but that was the sort of background he gave to himself. He kept flitting up and down with his thin voice going, talking about his wretched self, and never a word of clear, firm statement from first to last. He was thinner and sillier and more pointless than if he'd been real and alive. Only then, you know, he wouldn't have been in my bedroom here. If he had been alive, I should have kicked him out.
Of course, there are poor mortals like that.
Yeah, and there's just as much chance of their having ghosts as the rest of us, I suppose.
What gave a sort of point to him, you know, was the fact that he did seem within limits to have found himself out. The mess he'd made of haunting had depressed him terribly. He'd been told it would be a lark. He'd come expecting it to be a lark. And here it was, nothing but another failure added to his record. He paused and stood regarding me. He remarked that, strange as it may seem to me, nobody had given him the amount of sympathy I was giving him now. Don't you brood on these things too much, I said. The thing you've got to do is to get out of this. Get out of this sharp. You pull yourself together and try. I can't, he said. You try, I said. And try he did.
Try? How?
A gleam of interest from Sanderson here at last. Well. Passes.
Passes? What do you mean, passes?
A complicated series of gestures and passes with the hands. Now, that's how he'd come in, and that's how he had got to get out again. Lord, what a business I had.
But how could any series of passes
My
possibly...
dear man, you want everything clear. I don't know how. All I know is that you do, that he did. After a fearful time, you know, he got his passes right. And suddenly, he disappeared.
And did you observe these passes, these gestures?
Yes. It was very strange. I can't, he said. And suddenly he sat down on a little chair at the foot of the bed and began to sob. Lord, what a harrowing, whimpering thing he seemed. You pull yourself together, I said. Tried to pat him on the back, and my confounded hand went through him. By that time, you know, I wasn't nearly so massive as I'd been on the landing. I got the full strangeness of it all. I remember snatching my hand back out of him, as it were, with a little thrill, and walking over to the dressing table. You pull yourself together, I said to him, and try. And in order to encourage him and help him, I began to try as well.
What, the passes?
Yes, the passes. I tried them as well.
But wasn't that rather...
No, this is interesting.
Oh, it's interesting now, is it, Sanderson?
You mean to say that this ghost of yours gave away...
Did his level best to give away the whole confounded barrier? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, he didn't, though. He couldn't. Or he would have gone there, too.
And that's precisely it.
That is precisely it.
But at last he did it?
At last he did it, yes. I had to keep him up to it hard, but he did it at last, rather suddenly. He despaired. We had a scene, then he got up abruptly and asked me to go through the whole performance slowly, so that he might see. I believe, he said, if I could see, I should spot what was wrong at once. And he did. I know, he said. What do you know, said I. I can't do it if you look at me. I really can't. It's been partly that all along. I'm such a nervous fellow that you put me out. Well, we had an argument. Naturally, I wanted to see. But he was as obstinate as a mule, and suddenly I'd come over as tired as a dog. All right, I said, I won't look at you. And I turned towards the mirror on the wardrobe by the bed. He started off very fast. I tried to follow him by looking in the looking-glass. Round went his arms and hands, so and so, and then, with a rush, he came to the last gesture of all. You stand erect and open out your arms. Like this. Just like this he stood. And then he didn't. I wheeled around from the looking-glass to him. There was nothing. I was alone with the flaring candles and a staggering mind. No. What had happened? Had anything happened? Had I been dreaming? And then, with an absurd note of finality, the clock upon the landing discovered the moment was ripe for striking 1. So, bing! That's all that happened.
And then you went to bed?
What else was there to do?
And the passes?
I believe I could do them now.
Well, could you really?
Yes.
They won't work.
No, but if they do...
I'd rather you didn't, Clayton.
Why?
I'd rather he didn't, that's all.
But he hasn't got them right.
All the same, I'd just rather he didn't.
You don't, in all honesty.
True or
believe
not,
if
to
you-
go through those gestures and passes would... Well, it would be mocking a serious matter.
Yes, but you just can't believe
Why
it.
shouldn't I believe what he told us? None of us knows what happens after... Well, it's possible, that's all.
Clayton, you're too good a liar for us. Most of it was all right, but that disappearance... Tell us, it's a tale of cock and bull, isn't it?
You watch me, Sanderson. Just you watch me.
What are you doing?
He's going through the passes.
Well, I don't think... Look, Clayton, it was a good tale, but I really don't think you...
There!
That's very good, Clayton. But as a Freemason and a member of the Lodge of the Four Kings, I know many of these gestures, and there's one little detail left out.
I know. I believe I could tell you which.
Well?
This one. Right?
Yes?
That, you know, was what he couldn't get right. How do you...
Look, most of this business, and particularly how you invented it, I don't understand at all, but just that phase I do. Now, these happen to be a series of gestures connected with a certain branch of esoteric masonry, known only to a few, including myself. And I do not see I can do any harm in telling you just the proper twist of the hands. After all, if you know, you know, and if you don't, you don't.
I know nothing, except what the poor devil let out last night.
Then watch me. Now, the part you got wrong should go like this. There. You see?
Now I can do the whole thing right. Can I not?
If you want to, yes. I imagine you can.
I wouldn't begin, Clayton, if I were you.
It's all right. Matter is indestructible. You don't think any jiggery-pokery of this sort is going to snatch Clayton into the world of shades? Not it. You may try, Clayton, as far as I'm concerned, until your arms drop off at the shoulders.
I don't believe that, Clayton. You've made me half believe in that story somehow, and I don't want to see the thing done.
My goodness, are you afraid, Wish?
I believe that if he goes through these motions right, he'll go.
No, he'll not do anything of the sort, because As we all know, there's only one way out of this world, and Clayton is 30 years from that.
Clayton, you're a fool. A damn fool.
I decline to argue further. Let the thing be tried. Here goes.
No, please!
Wish! Please, leave me alone.
Supposing
Oh, for God's sake, Wish, shut up! It's up to him!
Be quiet, both of you. Don't you see? Are you all so stupid? He's just having us on. It's another of his jokes.
You think so, Sanderson?
Of course I do.
Look at him. His face. What's happening to his face?
My God, he's changing. His face is...
It's as if he were frozen.
Look out, he's falling! Grab him, someone!
All right, I've got him.
He's fainted.
Oh, what's happened? Is he all right?
It wasn't a joke, was it?
No. He's dead.
The Inexperienced Ghost starred Donald Houston as Clayton, Christopher Guard as Sanderson, Michael Cochrane as Wish, John Gillette as Evans, and Gary Cady as the barman. It was dramatised by Patricia Mays, and the director was Derek Hoddinott.